And we've always heard, and I've heard through my stories, and maybe Joshua and Chasity has heard through their similar stories, that for every federal Indian policy that was placed upon all Indian people, it takes 7 generations to heal from each one of them. So for all of us who are now EMS responders, whether we're EMTs, whether we're paramedics, we carry that same trauma that is genetically within us to every call we go on and every patient we deal with, from the most littlest patient who have just put their feet on Mother Earth until those elders who are about to leave to the spirit world. They have those same traumas that we have, that we are responding to. And that is something that off-reservation EMS doesn't understand or has never dealt with. Their traumas come from the calls that they go to. But we have this genetic trauma makeup already inside of us.
That's Monty Fronk, a member of the Mukwa clan of the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe tribe, an emergency medical technician for the tribe.
As you mentioned before, Navajo Nation is a very large area, over 27,000 square miles. We do have 15 stations spread across the Navajo Nation. We do transport to areas on the reservation and off the reservation. So Navajo Nation EMS is the only ambulance service in the United States that has this very large service area. Transports can be anywhere from across the street from our station to as far as 2-3 hours. So a call can take up half of our 12-hour shift. So majority of our staff are EMTs, very small part of our paramedics. Our EMTs have phenomenal patient care. I read their reports, very great reports, and I think they're very great healthcare providers in the field.
That's Joshua Ellison, a member of the Navajo Nation and emergency medical technician for the tribe.
My grandpa raised me, but I would always ask him, why ain't you teaching us our language? And that's what he would say. Well, me and your grandmother, we were treated so bad in boarding schools that we don't ever want our grandkids to go through that. So now we are in a process of trying to revitalize our language. My granddaughters are in pre-kindergarten, and they are in the immersion classroom where they speak the language, the first part, and then the second part is regular classroom. It's so neat. They come in and they'll play and they'll be talking Blackfoot. It's so cute. So hopefully they'll be able to teach us.
That's Chasity Williamson Tatzi, a paramedic for the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. This is the Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jayson Blair. Today, I'm joined by Monty Fronk, Chasity Williamson Tatzi, and Joshua Ellison. Monty is a member of the Mukwa clan of the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe in Minnesota and an emergency medical technician for his tribe. Chasity is a member of the Blackfeet Nation and a paramedic for her tribe. And Joshua is a member of the Navajo Nation and an emergency medical technician for his tribe. Several months ago, Monty joined me to discuss the story of his daughter, Nada Fronk. Nada was sex trafficked, and after going missing several times between the ages of 14 and 16, she had just begun to get her life on track before she was murdered on May 26, 2021. Nada died at the young age of 24 years old. We discussed the centuries-old challenge of missing and murdered Indigenous people. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, I recommend you go back and listen to it. The challenges facing Native communities when it comes to people who go missing or who are murdered are not new, but my hope is that an intense focus on them now, as illustrated by the work of U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the first native to hold that position, provides an opportunity for all of us to help usher in real change. Monty and I's conversations in that episode and after led to discussions about some of the challenges Native communities experience, particularly in his work as an emergency medical technician and first responder for his tribe. We discussed the challenges that tribes face across the country, across the continent, in providing medical, police, fire, and other emergency services, and how those challenges align and how they differ. Tribal first responders deal with vast wilderness in the northern stretches of Alaska, enormous, sparsely populated lands in the Navajo Nation, and checkerboarded tribal communities broken up into pieces in other places like Minnesota and Oklahoma. We decided to bring this group together to discuss the challenges related to and the triumphs of emergency medical first response in Indian country, and we're releasing this first episode with them during Emergency Medical Services Week, an annual celebration of those important first responders. Our second episode will be released next week. Monty and I have returned to some of the challenges in Indian country in our conversations, including basic physiological needs like food and water, and those related to safety, such as access to healthcare and communications, emergency medical services, firefighting, law enforcement, and other services. In the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a traditional Dene storyteller, Sunny Dooley, a keeper of the traditions, spoke to Scientific American, where she explained how disadvantage and injustice have shaped her people's encounter with the novel coronavirus. She talked about how when a Dene, whom the Spanish conquistadors named the Navajo, sent a notice to their local radio station so that everyone in the community could know who had died, she said that normally those death notices, listing the people who have passed on, their ages, where they lived, their names, their clans, takes less than 5 minutes a week to read. She talked about reading for 45 minutes on one July week when she looked at the death notices during the pandemic. She said the ages ranged from 26 to 89, with most of the dead being in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. She spoke about having electricity but no running water, how the groundwater is naturally contaminated with arsenic and uranium, and how few people had the money, even if possible, to drill a well. She talked about tribal members taking a 250-gallon tank of water on the back of a pickup truck to help people get something to drink. She talked about the rates of diabetes, heart disease, alcoholism, and the high rates of suicide. She said that every social ill you could think of was present, and COVID just made all those vulnerabilities more apparent. She said she viewed COVID as a monster that was just feasting on them, because the world had built the perfect human for it to invade. And the simple societal resources seen in other places were not always there. The Navajo Nation, for example, is the size of West Virginia, but there are only 13 grocery stores within the reservation. These challenges compound the already difficult jobs of first responders who toil away even in the best case scenarios, fighting raging fires, responding to heart attacks and falls, domestic violence incidents, and natural disasters. Tribal emergency medical professionals face unique challenges such as historical trauma, blood memory, being related to the family or clan members when it comes to everyone they serve, remoteness, lack of staffing and funding, yet they resiliently forge ahead to serve their communities. On that other side of the equation, there are stories of successes that are rarely told in non-native media. In another Scientific American article, the author writes about Crystal Lee, another member of the Navajo tribe, and a scientist and assistant professor at the University of New Mexico College of Population Health. She sounded the alarm about pandemics in 2017 at a United Nations conference. And during the pandemic, she turned a quarantine hotel into a mental health facility to address collective trauma and created a native healthcare company for those suffering from mental health and behavioral trauma that's impacted Indigenous people throughout the country. Her approach became a model across America. As much as this is a conversation about what's missing, it's also a conversation about what's present. This episode was recorded live with Patreon members whose questions you'll hear toward the end of next week's episode. Today, in this first of 2 episodes, we're going to begin a discussion on the role of being a first responder in emergency medical situations, the unique role that tribal emergency medical service professionals play in fighting the challenges in their communities, how they collaborate with other providers and first responders, some of the areas where we can all also learn from Native emergency medical practitioners, and the role that genocide, discrimination, and sovereignty play in the current battle for safety in Indian country. So before we really get started, I want to thank you guys for coming on. And I just want to thank the listeners who showed up. I'm sure they're going to have much better questions than I do that'll really inform it. I'll take questions as we go and certainly save some time in the end for questions, because I'm sure as all of our guests talk, everyone's going to get a lot more insight and probably have a lot more questions and ideas. So interesting people here. Gathered into this conversation in a very interesting, important topic. I'll go ahead and start with my intro. So, the Navajo Nation is vast. It stretches 17 million acres and crosses the borders of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. It's larger than West Virginia, Maryland, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Vermont, and other states. It's larger than New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island if you were to combine them all into one state. It's a vast space, and there are approximately 143,000 people living in 41,000 households, making the Navajo Nation Reservation one of the least densely populated regions within the U.S. borders. There are only 6.2 people for every square mile. This geography and the demographics of the reservation presents unique challenges when it comes to providing any type of healthcare services. As you'll hear from our guests today, there are places on the Navajo reservation where there are no street signs or, in some cases, confusing house numbers. The number of hospitals and medical facilities that can handle serious trauma are few and far between. It was in stark relief during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were 31,000 confirmed cases by August 2021 and 1,377 deaths. Step back and think about that. That's 18 months into the pandemic, and nearly 1% of the population is gone from one disease. Indigenous reservations are not monoliths, though, and have vastly different sizes and shapes, from large ones like the Navajo Nation and the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to ones like the Ojibwe bands or smaller reservations that dot Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Montana. Today, we're joined for a conversation with emergency medical first responders for a discussion about Native emergency medical services, including some of the unique challenges faced on reservations around the country, both in terms of their geography, access to resources, and their populations that they serve. We're also going to discuss some of the powerful forces in history that impact the way that this work is done. Some of it might be hard for you to imagine. But we're going to also discuss some of the triumphs and unique cultural elements of providing care in Native communities that have persisted despite efforts to assimilate and eliminate Native people. And some of those special bonds between these emergency medical service workers and the populations that they serve that in many ways are worthy of being emulated. This is not just about what's wrong, it's also about what's going right. As much as this conversation is about what's missing, it's also a conversation about what's present, successful, and remarkable. For many of these reasons, this is why this conversation is being released during the National Emergency Medical Services Week. Today, we're joined by Chasity Williamson Tatzi of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, Monty Fronk of the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe, and Jayson Ellison of the Navajo Nation. I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Monty, since you've previously been on the podcast with me. You came in January to talk about your daughter, Nada, and you're also the one who's responsible for bringing us all together for this conversation. So I wanted to turn it over to you.
Well, miigwech for allowing this, Jayson, to happen during National EMS Week. You know, the title for this year's EMS Week, we honor our past and forging our future. And that really, I think, reflects Indian country very much. I will introduce myself in my traditional Ojibwe language, which we say Bozu, Awan Indihinagaz, Monty Fronk Indigo, Mille Lacs Band in Dujaba, Chiminising in Da, Iwadi Tribal Emergency Management and EMS in Dinoke and Makwaduduum. And what that says, Bozu means hello. I served the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, which is one of the 11 sovereign nations in Minnesota. I oversee emergency management and EMS for the community. I live in our District 2A Chiminising, which means Chiminising means people of the island district in where I live at, and my jurisdiction is 85 square miles. But we will talk about more, which in the word of checkerboarding, what that means for my service. I have been an EMT now for over 30 years, and this is just an honor because every National EMS Week, when they honor all EMS across the country, they talk about different jurisdictions, they talk about hospital-based, fire-based, but they never talk about, which I feel is the forgotten EMS, which is tribal EMS. Because there are 580 federally recognized tribes from Alaska to the West Coast, to the East Coast, to the Southwest, to the Southeast, who all have tribal EMS programs, but just never get mentioned during this very important work. So it's an honor, Jayson, that you are doing this for this and having my relatives join us who are fellow EMS from their tribal communities.
Yeah. And Monty, was really, when you brought up the idea, I was honored by the idea that you thought I would be a good person to help you all tell your stories. So hopefully I live up to that.
Yeah, thank you.
Josh, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Jayson, Monty, thank you guys again for the invite. On behalf of the Navajo Nation, we really do appreciate the platform and hosting this podcast during the National EMS Week. Yate, my name is Josh. I am an emergency medical technician with the Navajo Nation Emergency Medical Service. This year is my 12th year of service to the nation. Recently I was assigned to our Shiprock station. I've been reassigned to public relations and recruitment. I am a New Mexico EMT and also licensed as an EMT in Arizona. So, as you mentioned before, Navajo Nation is a very large area, over 27,000 square miles. We do have 15 stations spread across the Navajo Nation. We do transport to various areas on the reservation and off the reservation. So Navajo Nation EMS is the only ambulance service in the United States that has this very large service area. Transports can be anywhere from across the street from our station to as far as 2-3 hours. So a call can take up half of our 12-hour shift. So majority of our staff are EMTs, very small part of our paramedics. Our EMTs have phenomenal patient care. I read their reports, very great reports, and I think they're very great healthcare providers in the field.
Wow, that's awesome. Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate it. And then my friend from the Blackfeet Nation, Chasity.
Hello, my name is Chasity Williamson Tatzi. I am an Amscopi Gunny of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We're also known as the Blackfeet Nation. We have approximately 17,000 enrolled members. Our reservation is 1.5 million acres. We are located off the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. We have the Canadian border in between us and our sister tribes. Our transport times are long too. I think it's about 2 hours to the nearest facilities to like for cardiac traumas, whatever. We do have one IHS that's located in Browning, where we usually transport the patients to, and they'll be sent to the other hospitals.
Thanks, Chasity. I really appreciate it. How long have you been doing it again, Chasity? I can't remember.
Oh, excuse me. I am currently the director of the Blackfeet Tribal EMS, and altogether I have approximately 15 years. I am a paramedic. I originally started in 1994, right out of high school. I worked for 10 years. Then PTSD got the best of me, and I went on a 10-year drug binge, I guess, best way to say it. I currently have 9 years being sober off of meth.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And just working towards getting everything I gave up during my drug addiction. So,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is, it's an accomplishment. I was actually just thinking about that last night. I think I had said to somebody, we should, hold a parade for people who can maintain sobriety. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those issues momentarily. I wanted to go ahead and start the conversation, just sort of framing things, I think, because I think for many of us, we have a hard time imagining some of those issues that we were talking about with tribal first response. But a lot of us don't even understand what it's like to be an emergency medical services professional and what first response is like in general. So I wanted to just step back and talk a little bit about what the job of providing emergency medical care is like. Any of you guys want to get us started with Monty? Do you want to jump in? Or
Yeah, I think when Jayson, when you hear that question, and my relatives here on this podcast, we're all thinking of so many different things, because when you look at all of us who are EMS all across Indian country, and again, there are 580 federally recognized tribes. You have only 3 of us on this call this evening, and there are so many other tribal EMS professionals across the United States. And when we look at this, for some reason, it's either a calling, it's like myself, I am Bear Clan, I'm a Protector Clan, that's what my job does, and it is of service with that one. We've probably had mentors who were in this, who helped guide us into this profession. And for some of us, like myself, who grew up watching Emergency on TV with Randolph Mantooth as firefighter paramedic Johnny Gage, that was our Tuesday night shows. And who ever thought that in my career I would have got the chance to work with Randy personally on a tribal video about 10 years ago, which was an amazing honor. But also I had a wonderful fire mentor growing up who unfortunately just passed away at 80 of his Alzheimer's. and I had the honor of doing a eulogy for him and just telling what his mentoring, just by how he lived his life, did for me. But we also know that when you are an EMS professional in your tribal nation, you inside you have the same, we call it blood memory or traumas that every one of our calls go to. We live it because we grew up in it, and now we are serving, going out into the communities. And if you look at the history of Indian country across the United States, there have been federal policies since first contact to basically create genocide within all Indian country. From first contact, we had the treaty times, which we, ceded land and territory because Dom society wanted our resources. Then, all of our children were taken away and sent to boarding schools during the assimilation process. And we all live with that trauma of grandparents who were forcibly removed and basically were taught, to kill the Indian and save the man and woman inside of them. Then we had what was called relocation back in the 50s, where relatives were sent all over the United States just to, again, to get their hands washed of taking, being responsible for their duties. And then some tribes in the late 50s had termination policies, and we've always heard, and I've heard through my stories, and maybe Joshua and Chasity has heard through their similar stories, that for every federal Indian policy that was placed upon all Indian people, it takes 7 generations to heal from each one of them. So for all of us who are now EMS responders, whether we're EMTs, whether we're paramedics, we carry that same trauma that is genetically within us to every call we go on. And every patient we deal with, from the most littlest patient who have just put their feet on Mother Earth until those elders who are about to leave to the spirit world, they have those same traumas that we have, that we are responding to. And that is something that off-reservation EMS doesn't understand or has never dealt with. Their traumas come from the calls that they go to. But we have this genetic trauma makeup already inside of us.
Carrying that weight.
Yep.
Right. Carrying that weight into every
call. Because every call is a relative of ours, either by family, by blood, by clan, by chapter house. And I know my brothers and sisters will talk about that in their world also.
Yeah. And one of the things that you had mentioned when you were introducing yourself and you were talking about your work, you had mentioned the checkerboarding.
Yep.
And just when you were talking about how every policy that impacted natives in the United States exasperated, extended, created new trauma. And I just think of that as like a great example. Could you talk a little bit about the impact for you all of some of those policies on the work that you do today? Because I think the checkerboarding seems like a good example of how it really makes your job very different than your neighboring non-native, non-tribal EMS workers.
Yep. Chasity or Joshua, I know you have many calls, and I know you see this also when 911 is called for service. And if you want to elaborate, I don't want to take this up because I know you have years of service and your eyes have seen similar.
Monty, you did make a really great point as far as the calls that we run on could be our relatives, whether it be through the clanship system, or their blood relatives. The Navajo Nation is super, super large. So when I do respond to these calls, a lot of the times I don't know these people, but we have that connection through our clans, and we're Navajo. So we have this belief, if you're Navajo, you're all related to each other some sort of way. So that kind of drives that home for me. I personally don't live on the Navajo Nation. I live in a border town, but I love working on the reservation, been doing it my whole career, mainly because I love helping. I love helping my people. Sometimes you see people are at their worst, but that's when I'm at my best. That's best I can best describe it. Seeing people hurt, seeing people sick, it's never a good thing, but kind of makes me want to work harder to try to get them to where I want them to be at, which is healthy and get into the hospital. A lot of the policies that Monty had mentioned that were, I guess, implemented long before I was born are still affecting us today, as far as all these different red flags with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Health Service. But that doesn't stop us as Indigenous people. It actually drives us, and we're still pushing through all the different challenges. And that's what I like about being Native American, is we're not, from a third world country where we have the same technology. We still have the same ambulances and protocols as our people on the outside. We just have another cultural aspect that we have to consider as far as pre-hospital care goes.
Right. A different level of sort of, right. Are there, for any of you guys, some examples that you could draw from the history itself to the actual impact on the work that you do now?
I can just think of examples of just when you hear about our health disparities in Indian country, and this is across all Indian country, whether you're a reservation, a village, a rancheria, a community, that certain health disparities affecting us all. We all just went through the pandemic, and it just, again, our indigenous relatives across all Indian country still do not have immunity against Eastern European diseases because of the forced assimilation protocols that happen with us. Is most of us, our traditional foods and traditional diets were so erased out of our system. And many of us grew up on or lived on commodity foods, which was totally not genetically what our bodies deal with. Then you have all the historical trauma of what the boarding schools did and what relocation did. And it creates, just when you look at hypertension, you look at our rate of diabetes, you look at our rate of suicide, you look at the, unfortunately, other, neglect, abuse issues we're seeing all across our tribal nations. Unfortunately, us three can probably say that for every statistic you see about a rate of diabetes, a rate of domestic violence, a rate of suicide, all across Indian country, when you look at what Indian Health Services put out, the CDC puts out, BIA, unfortunately, we are always the highest. We're always 2, 3, 4 times higher than the average across the United States. And when people call 911 for our services as EMS, this is what Joshua and myself and Chasity, when we're going to a call, have to think about when we hear the call. When the dispatcher tells us what kind of call we are going to, and when you have that delay of time to get to that location, you start to pre-plan what you may be going into, to say what health disparity, what behavioral health. And as Joshua said, and helping chat talk about too, then if it's a family member, is it an auntie? Is it a cousin? Is it a sibling? Is it a member of your clan? And that puts another piece of response in that too, because now we're dealing with our own relatives, our own family members, that we have to see them, as Joshua says, in their good times and in their bad times. But I believe culturally, as Joshua said, we provide a cultural, competent EMS care that probably our off-reservation EMS professionals probably do not understand very well, unless maybe they work in a large urban area with a very large urban native population.
Right.
Yeah.
And Chasity, you had mentioned earlier that, there was a pause in your career. You said that PTSD sort of got you. And just thinking about the discussion about trauma, and I know from the work that I've done before with first responders, PTSD is a risk for anyone providing first response. Do you think for you, your own struggles were exasperated by the intergenerational trauma, and is that something you and your team see in your work today?
I believe so. When I first started with EMS, I was told whatever you see here stays here. And that, it was just vague. And so when I started having the nightmares and the fear and didn't know what was going on, I would reach out, and we have that stigma that you're not, you're weak if you reach out for help, and so I just buried it. I would bury it, bury it, bury it. And then I started drinking so I wouldn't have the nightmares. And then while I was drinking, I got introduced to cocaine so I wouldn't sleep. And then it just progressed on to meth. But I believe so. I stayed with my grandpa. My grandpa raised me, but I would always ask him, why ain't you teaching us our language? And that's what he would say. Well, me and your grandmother, we were treated so bad in boarding schools that we don't ever want our grandkids to go through that.
Oh, wow.
So now we are in a process of trying to revitalize our language. My granddaughters are in pre-kindergarten, and they are in a immersion classroom where they speak the language, the first part, and then the second part is regular classroom. It's so neat. They come in and they'll play and they'll be talking Blackfoot. It's so cute. So hopefully they'll be able to teach us.
So let me make sure I have this right, that your grandfather was so afraid that there would be another set of policies someday, like the boarding school assimilation policies, where they tried to, and, tell me if I have this wrong, but sort of push native culture away from natives. Your grandfather was so fearful of that he didn't really speak the language and didn't teach people out of a fear that you all would have to go through that. Is that right, Chasity?
Yes, they were beat for speaking the language. He would tell me stories about having to kneel on broomsticks, if they got caught. They would run away to go home. And his mother was fluent Blackfeet. She didn't speak English, so they would come and they would take him back and they would threaten her, with whatever. And so they just didn't want us to be beat. That's what they were afraid of.
And they carry that. It reminds me of my grandmother, who even after getting the right to vote was, getting the right to vote and during Jim Crow, to the day she died in her late 90s, encouraged or was afraid to vote. She wouldn't vote. And just thinking about that and thinking about how families carry trauma on generation after generation. And you guys had brought up some of the mental health and behavioral health issues. I was just curious, as somebody who has experience in that field, I'm thinking about where I live right now outside of DC. If someone were having a mental health crisis and they were in the room with me right now, it would probably be 5 minutes to the police at our door. The nearest hospital is it's a level 2 trauma hospital with its own psych ward. It's about 11 minutes away. It would probably be a 30-minute affair to get a temporary detention order or to get the person to voluntarily go. I'm curious what it's like, because I just think about it from a mental health professional that those mental health problems become much bigger problems the more time.
Yeah, there we have a tribal mental health program, and the IHS, and there I think is like two
Indian
counselors.
IHS is the Indian Health Service, which is
Yeah,
the
the government.
federal, yeah,
Yeah.
the federal government.
So we have like two counselors in the IHS and maybe three in the tribal one. So the resources are very limited, and we are seeing a lot of the drug psychosis now. A lot of our young people, we do a lot of transports to these outside psychiatric hospitals.
You mentioned the number of counselors. For how many people? Because one of the things I was just thinking about and I imagine it's true for you guys as EMS workers, in mental health, you want to be culturally competent, right? If you're not culturally competent, it's not to say that someone who isn't, of a certain race or ethnicity can't be helpful, but you do want to have some competence around the culture of the people you're treating. So it's for Chastity. How many people are?
I think on our reservation we have maybe 10 to 12,000 people, if I'm not mistaken. So that is
very large for that.
Yeah, we do make up with it. There's a lot of people that practice our traditional ways, so that is where I got my help from, was through our culture and our religion.
And for you, Josh and Monty, you guys were mentioning half-day transport calls. And, I was just thinking about the example that I was talking about before. If somebody had it wasn't a mental health crisis, but it was a cardiac arrest or an allergic reaction that could potentially be problematic, an 11-minute drive is probably not that bad. We've got a level 1 trauma center not too far away. It's like a quick helicopter or really quick drive away. What's it like for you guys in those situations?
Well, obviously, for us with the Mille Lacs Band is that we rely on off-reservation EMS to come on the reservation. I'm the EMT who will get to the scene first if I'm in all the districts that we have. But knowing that, when you call 911, and Joshua is to be utterly respected for the distance. I mean, I know my community members have to wait half an hour or longer at times, and of course, right now we're seeing all across the United States, both tribal and non-tribal, this EMS staffing is at a very tough crisis level right now, where sometimes there isn't even our primary ambulance who comes onto our main community isn't available. And we call it mutual aid for the next available ambulance services. And that could be, 46 minutes away to get to my community. And so when I look at the classes I teach for like the CPR classes I teach and for the Narcan response training, and basic first aid, I really try to stress to my students who I teach to understand the distance that it takes. Because you said your case, Jayson, you're in a very large metropolitan area.
Yep.
And then you look at it as the behavioral health unit issues with that one. And again, I think all across Indian country, behavioral health will never be enough to match the need. Even Chastity says 3 behavioral health staff for that many enrolled members, and with that much trauma that we're dealing with that one, and even and then you look at pediatric, and I know Josh would talk about this more. You look at a pediatric situation or a child
where you need specialized care.
It goes hours away. And I know even when my youngest daughter was going through her behavioral health cycle, she's 21 now, but she was in early teens. And when we brought her into the hospital, the nearest pediatric psych bed we could find was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's the only one they could find. And at that time, I was not going to look, I was going to be respectful of my fellow EMTs who were at that time truly volunteer. And I was not going to have them get out of bed, come to that hospital 11:30 at night, and transport my daughter all the way to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because that's the only pediatric psych bed they could find. She will self-stabilize in a couple hours. And I said, we'll just keep her here, because at that time, our main ambulance services were truly the paid on call or volunteer ambulance services. And I was not going to get two EMTs who I've known for years out of bed to do that. And
so is it fair to say, Monty, and also Josh, and I want to come back to that. You made me think of something bringing up your daughter and the behavioral health, and I want to come back to that piece. But does it mean for the EMTs and the paramedics who are, and same thing with you, Chasity, who are working on your reservations, that they need a different set of skills? Because there's some things, right, that if you get to a patient in a certain amount of time, you can stabilize them fairly quickly. But they need to get to a hospital in X amount of time, right? Fairly quickly. But if you're talking about these long trips, do the personnel need different types of skills?
I think, Josh, you could probably talk about that a lot, because you have, and again, it's such to be respected, Josh, for when you talk about your service area. I mean, some of us can't even imagine this, Josh. And then you deal with those calls, and I think the skills, Josh, you can go ahead on that, because I think you have an amazing team down there, because again, there's no tribal EMS anywhere that has unique challenges as you do down Navajo EMS.
Yeah, and probably no EMS period, at least here, that's got the vastness and the vastness of the Navajo Nation, the sparse population, which presents its own challenges. So go for it, Josh.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, we have very long transport times, but I think a unique thing about Navajo EMS is we have a very diverse team, more into our more central agencies of our nation. A lot of the times they're from their areas, and then you have the outskirts of our reservation, where a lot of the pre-hospital providers in those areas are not from those areas, or they're not Navajo. So with that being said, we have providers from urban areas, Albuquerque, Phoenix, Denver, metropolitan areas that come in, and majority of the time, the thing that kind of makes them want to work for Navajo is, as funny as it is to say, in our profession, is our pay. And, that's what brings them to our reservation, but they don't see it. They don't understand the long transport time. So their mentality is, I'm going to transport, I'm going to get to the hospital right away. What they don't know is that it's going to take 2 hours to get there, but your closest hospital is like 3-4 hours away. For example, in Ojo Encino, and that's in our eastern.
Are you saying, Josh, 2 hours to get to the patient and then 3 hours to get to the hospital?
Correct. So
wow.
Yeah. So Ojo and
5 hours from the 911 call, the person might end up in a hospital. Wow.
Correct. Yeah. And a good example of that would be in Ojo Encino, which is just west of Cuba, New Mexico. They have a station there, but they don't have a hospital within a couple of hours of their area. So it might take maybe an hour or two because of the very rough terrain, but it's going to take another couple hours to get out with that patient, get on the highway, and they're driving into Albuquerque, which is another hour and a half, 2 hours away. So those are the calls that kind of take forever. So there's Ojo, a bunch of other stations very similar to Ojo. Where I'm from, Shiprock, we have a large coverage area there, but our furthest point from where we're at is 45 minutes, but that doesn't mean we can't go beyond where we're supposed to cover.
Right.
But I think one thing that's an eye opener to these to our team members who are from the metropolitan, more urban areas, is how much time they have with the patient. So I always tell our new providers, in Navajo EMS, you're going to see medicine work. So in urban areas, you push your medications, and then get them to the
You don't
hospital.
see the results, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So here, you push your medications, you're going to see your medicine work. And by the time you get your patient to the hospital, they're either a lot better, or you kept them the same long enough to at least get to definitive care. And that's kind of an eye opener to them. And also something that's very unique. I don't know if it's very unique, but with Navajo EMS, we never had an FTO program, and we still don't.
What's
So we
FTO?
don't have kind of like a field training program.
Training? Okay.
Yeah, like a field training program to kind of acclimate the providers to our service. We don't have that type of program yet. So right now we have new providers from these areas that are really great medics, but when they get introduced to our system and they're only third riding for a couple days and they're on their own, that's kind of like, I guess for them, it's kind of scary because now they're with the patient for a few. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I would imagine most EMTs are used to brief times with the patient, not long conversations with them, probably not. I always find if you're a medical professional, you have to spend a lot of time with a patient, you inevitably become a therapist too. Mm-hmm. You're hearing their whole story. You're working to keep their spirit up, all those things that you get with good medical care. And it just sort of seems like when I'm thinking of 2 hours to get there, 3 hours to take them back, that these people could be a part of your clan. You view them as a part of your family too. And I'd love to get you guys all to talk about this, but it's a different kind of relationship. And I imagine it affects care, I imagine, in some positive ways, but it's also a heavier burden, right? One of the things that I know from working in mental health, one of the things that we all learn is like, put your heart into the work during the day, but don't take it home with you. But when your patients are your family members, your clan members, people who have been through such similar experiences to you, how do you do that? Can you even do that? So I'm just curious how those things, those relationships and the time and all these things impact, the way you provide care and impact you. Chastity or Monty, anyone who wants to jump in there.
Say, Chastity, I think your story of your journey is definitely, I think, what Jayson was talking about, that the struggle that came into your life and how recovery is going so well for you now.
Yeah. And one of the things, just thinking about that is that, we work with a lot of first responders on trauma in big metropolitan areas who are spending a lot less time, aren't related to their, and so anything you guys would be willing to talk to about what mental health services are available for you all?
Well, I think, as you were saying, Jayson, when people call tribal EMS, for services, it could be something simple as a lift assist or a check welfare with that one, and again, or we could be going into, a very large crisis situation with that one of trauma. Every call for service is so different, and I think all across EMS United States, we get those becomes kind of routine calls, and then we get those crisis calls. But when I talk to other tribal EMS, and again, there's just 3 of us on this call for the 580 tribes. When you are looking at your patient who is a relative of yours, mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, auntie, uncle, cousin, clan member, and you are looking in their eyes and they're looking at you. And there's really no communication. It's all nonverbal. But you know what their eyes are telling you. They're looking at you to provide the care they need and the compassion that they need. And sometimes it's as simple as holding a hand of that relative or the elder of yours is just as much medicine as any medicine that a paramedic could give.
Right.
I think Joshua and Chasity and I have cried as much with our relatives when there has been a loss in our families, especially when we're on those calls and we have done everything medically we can to save their life. And is there a time to go into the next step, whether we call it going to the spirit world as we do as Ojibwe people? Joshua might have another term when their spirit leaves the body, and maybe Chasity does too out in the Blackfeet Nation. And we look at a role, what I have just in my life is you realize you're going from a EMS, EMT responder to now grieving with them in their time of loss. Because when we lose a loved one, when we lose one of our patients, it's usually one of us as a tribal EMS who has to tell the family of the very sad news of their loved one's passing. And especially when it's our own family member, our own relative, we feel it as hard as they do.
You can't leave it at work.
No, we can't. And many of us who live in the community like I do, you're always on duty. You're always an EMT. You're always a tribal EMT, because when you go to a ceremony, when you go to a powwow, when you go to a cultural event, you may be just civilian clothes, but I can pretty much tell you, I have a trauma bag in my vehicle. I bet you Joshua has one in his personal vehicle, and so does Chasity.
Right.
Because when we see a medical emergency happening or somebody not feeling well, and they go, "Hey, you're a tribal EMT, you're a tribal paramedic," even though we're off duty, they know that we have that skill, and they know that we will, as community members, will always provide care. And that's what we do. And that's what I think any EMS person does across the United States. But when it's that in your community and it's that cultural connection that we have, which so many other EMS don't have because of our spirituality and that ties we have to family, because we're all related in one way or another in Indian country. It definitely plays a big role. And I think Chastity's story was very poignant about the toll it can take.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
One of the things I was thinking about, Monty, when you came on in January, we talked about NADA and the challenge of missing murdered Indigenous people, particularly in that case, Indigenous women.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about some of the issues that you guys have brought up about things like chemical dependency or even violence. And, Josh, I know you mentioned before we started recording that some of the incidents of violence are becoming even more traumatic. I think you said people weren't fighting to fight; they were fighting to kind of kill each other, or some phrase along those lines. And Chastity, and thinking about your story, I'm wondering whether some of these health issues, the poverty you discuss, other things, whether they're sort of the trauma, right? The trauma that people experience, or sort of, I kind of think of it, whether they're all sort of interconnected, that it's a cycle of things that for those of you who are in EMS, you're dealing with the entire part of the cycle. you're dealing with missing people, you're dealing with people who are, whether it's in your day job or whether it's in your regular life, you're dealing with all of these kinds of traumas. And so that's why I wanted to turn it to you, Chasity, since you've been open about your post-traumatic stress. Actually, all of you have been. How did all of these things weigh on you? And do you have advice for other tribal first responders or first responders in general in terms of being able to take care of your mental health? I know you mentioned that there's this sort of stigma, and I think it's true among first responders in general, about not focusing. Like, if you had it over again, or if you had the chance to give someone, a young person coming up.
Yeah, so since I'm new at my job as a director, and that was one thing I wanted to focus on was, having a healthy mental health. So I try to have debriefings, quite often. There's been quite a few traumas, and for the most part, my crew, I have really a good team, and we rely upon our Indian humor quite a bit. And so I think that
Tell me
helps
about
a lot.
that.
And
Yeah.
it's also, they open up to one another.
Mhm.
So I think that is good. It's going in a positive direction. Yeah, and you were talking about different skills that they have. I have 2 paramedics, myself included, 4 AEMTs, 6 EMTs, and 9 student drivers currently. All the EMTs are endorsed with their medical airway, IV, IO. So the 9 students, they're going to be testing to take the EMT, but they are great. They're all really great at their job, and if I'm ever injured, or I really hope it's my crew that comes after me.
Hmm.
I have
That's
that
the best compliment,
faith in
right?
them. Yeah, they're very good.
This is the first of 2 episodes with Chasity, Joshua, and Monty. Join us next week for the second episode. If you'd like to join me for more discussions with other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook.